Well, a few days ago, we had on this platform Shannon Lanier, a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States of America. He spoke at length about the evils of slavery and why he wants all symbols and statues of slave owners and dealers removed from public places in America. Against the backdrop of Black Lives Matter movement, which spread like wildfire in the wake of extrajudicial killings of George Floyd, Shannon's feelings about the subject of slavery is known to have cut across large sections of America's various age groups and demographics. What is the history of slavery in America? How has institutional slavery affected the United States? What are the societal implications of the Black Lives Movement? To answer all those questions, joining us from Sussex, England, to take a further look at this is Richard Fillet, a professor of slavery and deputy vice chancellor, University of Sussex. Welcome to the program. Good to have you, Rich. Great to see you once again after a very long time. Richard, what's the history behind slavery? Let us understand it. I mean, because you've written many books about it. One of my favorite is Sugar Masters, where you talked about the slave plantations, the plantations in Southern America and the antebellum South and how slaves were traded. I mean, just take me through an understanding of this, Richard.
Good morning, Rufai. It's wonderful to speak with you. And good morning to everybody tuning in. To friends and colleagues across Nigeria, a country that I travel to a great deal. So lovely to be with you. I think it's really significant, Rufai, that you take this point this morning, because in 2019 was the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to what would become the United States. Obviously, the transatlantic slave trade had already existed by the time in 1619. It had already existed for 150 years, dating back really to the very earliest years of the early 1500s, although in a small number of cases. But the history of slavery in what would become the United States accelerates quickly from that early beginning in 1619, and accelerates fast through the rest of the 17th century and into the 18th century, so that by by 1800 there are almost 750,000 enslaved African American people, mostly at this point born in the United States. At this point, the numbers are slowing in the US of African-born peoples. But by 1860, in the eve of the American Civil War, almost 4 million enslaved African Americans live in the United States. And of course, they live in these southern states from Virginia through to Texas, and are producing some of the largest cash commodity products in the 19th century world, most particularly cotton, but also sugar, tobacco, and rice. And I think one point to really set us started here is understanding that by the middle of the 19th century, slavery is not some small or isolated business for America. Slave-grown cotton represents over 70% of America's total exports. It is slavery and it is cotton that is driving the American industrial revolution, its capitalist revolution forward. Slavery and capitalism advance together, and they advance in lockstep. America's slaveholders by 1860 are the richest slaveholders ever to have existed on the planet. They're politically powerful, they're rich, they're politically influential, and it rests on the back of the enslaved masses who work on the cotton fields and sugar fields below them.
Well, Professor Fillet, there's been a lot of talk about institutional and systemic racism in the United States in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests. How has institutional slavery affected the United States over the years?
Absolutely, in many ways, and it's an excellent question, because slavery not only established a brutal economic foundation for American growth through the 19th century, but it bequeathed and left a legacy of profound racism, a legacy that still continues to be with us today. It condemned, it created, in the words of African-American writer Saidiya Hartman, slavery created a political calculus, an arithmetic that devalued African-American lives. And it devalued them as human chattel. It devalued them as property. It eliminated humanity from the people who were enslaved. Of course, the enslaved people fought for their own humanity and struggled to define that and sustain that. And the Black Lives Matter movement today is connected to a long history of African-American political and street protest that is about shaping the African-American voice, defining African-Americans' place, and indeed fighting for equality within the United States. But slavery leaves a legacy of racism, and it leaves a legacy that devalues Black lives. And that is true through the 19th century, and it's true through the 20th century. And we can measure that devaluation in hundreds of different ways, from twisted life chances, from poor medical care, to levels of diabetes, which are almost twice the rate of white Americans. And indeed, we can measure that devaluation in the criminal justice system. And as we've seen through the case of George Floyd, the battle to define freedom, the battle to define equality within Americans' criminal justice system continues with us today. So yes, the legacies of slavery are deep. Slavery is not a bygone relic of America's past. Slavery is a legacy, and it lives with us today.
How do we begin to uproot that legacy? I want you to talk about the indoctrination that accompanied the slave trade. There was an idea that was sold. I think the white slave owners and white slave traders had to justify their treatment of their fellow human beings by dehumanizing them and saying that Black people are inherently inferior, they feel no pain, they don't love their children, which is why you can separate a nursing mother and sell her, and all kinds of horrors that remain today, such that till now there was a recent scandal with an American televangelist saying that slavery was a blessing to Black people and white people. There are people who actually think that those ideas are so ingrained that even Black people accept them. Harriet Tubman said she freed 1,000 slaves. She could have freed 1,000 more if they knew they were slaves. Black people have accepted this notion of our inferiority. How do you go about uprooting that?
I think you've touched on a really important topic, and it reaches all the way back to the very beginnings of slavery in America, in which white colonialists and white slaveholders developed a rationale, a defense mechanism. They called it the pro-slavery argument. And it unfolded in dozens of different ways, arguing that, in fact, enslaved people were childlike. And that was a common argument, of course. And indeed, in many cases, they believed that enslaved people would die if they were free. So these ideas reach back into the deep history of slavery. And it's not just about the systems of slavery in the United States, of course. This is an Anglo-centric definition of slavery that is as true for the Caribbean and indeed for the way in which the British acted in West Africa as it is for the history in the Anglo-American context. But you're absolutely right. One of the key issues is the indoctrination processes, but also the belittling processes that occur in thousands of different ways. And we can move that story forward, for example, into the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. And of course, one of the systems of the Jim Crow or segregation system of the American South in the 20th century was a belief that all African-American men would be referred to not as Mr., but as boy. Walking along the street, moving to the side, a system of deference that is encoded and African-American experience. But what is absolutely vital to understand and appreciate is that whilst this might appear a system of deference on one level, African-Americans had, from the very beginnings of slavery through to the modern period, been struggling against that voice, been struggling against and fighting against that demeaning, dehumanizing tradition of white Americans, and had been protesting and indeed rebelling against slavery from the very earliest of the years that it's created. But I think it's worth just closing here that what you say about this embodying of values that African Americans had. Well, during the 1960s, Reverend Martin Luther King, of course, wrote in the letter to a Birmingham jail, "Why We Can't Wait." And one of the things that King talked about was the cumulative effect of racial injustice on African American lives. That the cumulative effect was to create a sense of, as Dr. King called it, nobodiness. Well, the civil rights movement wasn't about nobodiness. It was all about creating myself, an actor, a man, a woman, an activist. It's reclaiming voice. And if you run right through to the present day, claiming that voice, claiming that tradition of civil disobedience is very much part of the Black Lives Matter movement, an ennobling movement in many respects for the African American voice, but a link from the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 all the way back through to the history of resistance, both in the 1960s, but earlier still, going back into the slave times.
Right, Richard, you didn't just study slavery, but you studied slavery in the University of Louisiana in the antebellum South of America, and you've seen the effect of this hands-on. You've seen the pain of this hands-on. In Nigeria here, we had somebody, a very famous figure, winner of the annulled June 12th election, MK Abiola, that fought so hard for reparation in Nigeria and for every part of Africa. Is this the time for reparation? Can we further that conversation? Is it something Black Lives Movement should take on and say, apart from all of this talk, there should be need for reparation, payment of reparation back to us here?
I think that is the direction of political travel. Absolutely, it is. What form of reparations is it likely to take? And there ranges from a lot of different options. And if we go back actually to a clear call for reparations, and that comes from CARICOM, which is the coordinating group of the Caribbean nations. And CARICOM have called for a 10-point plan of reparations that can be introduced in the Caribbean, and by logic back to West Africa, and indeed Western Africa, ranging down from Senegambia all the way through to Mozambique, in point of fact, which were the countries involved most heavily in the international slave trade. But the opportunity is ripe right now to press home the issues of reparations. How that comes is another question. Whether that comes in terms of a financial payment, or whether that in terms of it really comes through a kind of truth and reconciliation campaign remains to be seen. What's interesting is that in the context of the United States, there have been real efforts towards moving this conversation forward.
Professor Fillet, Prof, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. We need to take a quick commercial break. Please stay with us. When we return, the conversation will continue. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the morning show here on the Arise News channel. Still with us is Richard Fillet, a professor of slavery and deputy vice chancellor at the University of Sussex. Professor Fillet, thank you very much for staying with us. If you may just continue with the points you were making before I interrupted and we went on that commercial break. Thank you for staying with us.
A pleasure, and thank you. As we were talking about the importance of reparations, and I think at this moment in time, certain universities in the United States are offering, for example, scholarships and what like for descendants of enslaved African Americans, enslaved people who were connected through a long lineage back to those universities themselves. But these are small steps, if we're blunt. What's required, if we take CARICOM's lead, is not just a full formal apology for the injustices of slavery, but debt cancellation programs, knowledge exchange programs, technology transfer, and a whole range of important steps that can begin to address the legacies of slavery. But I think it's important, and the question from Rufai, I think, which is, what kind of costs are involved? If we take the West African context, for example, bear in mind that some 12 million young people were shipped from West Africa over the course of essentially 300 years, or at least 250 years, between the middle of the 16th century and the middle of the 19th century. If we capture that, we're talking about an economic cost to West Africa that is astronomical. It stripped the very, very best, youngest people from West Africa and transported them across the Atlantic. It is close to immeasurable to factor in just the price and consequence of that, of slavery alone, let alone the impact of colonialism and slavery together.
Well, sorry, Professor Fillet, sorry to interrupt you again. We need to take a quick break again to join our correspondent, Adefemi Akinsanya, who is at the Murtala Mohammed Airport in Lagos. Adefemi Akinsanya, over to you. Hello, Adefemi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear us? Yes, I can. Lovely. So we are.
Adefemi Akinsanya is at the Murtala Mohammed Airport in Lagos.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Well, we are on board the Air Peace flight going from Lagos to Abuja. As you can see, it's very early on in the boarding process. Little by little, in smaller groups, you have passengers approaching the aircraft. They would have traveled from the terminal via a bus to this boarding point here. They'll climb the steps and then they'll get upon this aircraft. If you just take a look down the passenger here, you can see that the employees here at Air Peace are taking social distancing very seriously. Each member of staff has their personal protective equipment. No passenger has been allowed upon this aircraft without their face mask. And as this process continues, we'll be able to see just how Air Peace are observing social distancing on board. I think that that's what has been the crucial aspect of the reopening, making sure that people are safe on board. It is still, as I said, very early on in the boarding process, but what we do know is definitely this flight will be leaving from Lagos and headed towards Abuja, one of the first flights to make this journey after airports were reopened here in the domestic side of Lagos Airport here. We also know that this is going to be a different type of journey. Not only is it about social distancing, but it's also about keeping people safe, making sure that there isn't any crossover between personnel and passengers. No food or drinks will be served via the staff here to the passengers here, just to limit any type of interactions between the passengers. It is a very short journey from Lagos to Abuja, just over an hour, but as you can see, Air Peace have been incredibly welcoming to us and have allowed us to observe how they're participating in social distancing very early on in this process. Dr. Rubin.
Well, thank you very much, Adefemi Akinsanya there at the Murtala Mohammed Airport, reporting live on the resumption of domestic flights in Nigeria. Well, Adefemi, I hope you are not going to Abuja. We hope to see you soon in the studio. Professor Fillet, well, we're back to you now. We had to take that live report from the Murtala Mohammed Airport here in Lagos. You were talking about reparation. If you may just continue, but I would also like to have your take on the removal of status. Do you think that this amounts to an erasure of history and memory, and whether or not this is something that is a wise choice to be made by protesters.
Absolutely. And I think the issue of memory is the key point. Whose memory? What is memory? Well, for so long, those statues represent a version of memory. They represent a version of the past. Now, many of the monuments that were erected, and most of them were put up at the end of the 19th century, so the 1890s, 1910s, just as many European nations were accelerating their conquest of colonial parts of the world, Africa included. So many of these monuments that are erected and put up all over Europe, but most significantly in Britain and the United States, begin to reflect on and celebrate the histories of people that were often major historical figures, but they were also often benefactors of cities and the like. But what's the significant point is, and this goes back to the question earlier, what is forgotten history? What is forgotten in memory? And it was, of course, forgotten, erased, ignored that these individuals have played critical roles in the history of slavery. Now, in the American context, a lot of those monuments that you see being torn down today were built in the 1890s, but also part of a movement at that time to create reconciliation between white Northerners and white Southerners. 30 years after the Civil War had ended, they're building a new landscape, and they use history as a way to bring Northerners and Southerners together, a kind of shared experience, if you like, of the Civil War. So they build monuments to Northern generals and monuments to Confederate generals. The fact that those Confederate generals were fighting for the institution of slavery was simply overwritten. It's simply ignored by the white monumentalists, if you like, and the opinions and views of African Americans are simply erased. Now, what's occurring right now is, of course, the dismantling and destruction of those statues all over the United States, but we've seen them in England. You might have seen in the news about the removal in Bristol of a monument to Edward Colston, who was a slave trader in the 17th century, but again, a benefactor to the city of Bristol. What's occurring here is not just a rewriting of history, but it's a completely different way of thinking about memory. What is a nation's memory? A nation's memory that's inclusive, that includes all voices. Well, if we include all voices, then we cannot have the monuments to these historic figures, to these slave-holding figures. That's the argument that Black Lives Matter and those who wish to pull down the monuments argue. Donald Trump, by contrast, has been very clear about protecting monuments, that it is part of America's heritage. And there are very strong arguments in both cases as to the rights and wrongs. But if we're moving forward to a more inclusive world in our post-COVID environment, if we're moving towards a more ethnically diverse, ethnically inclusive way of defining who we are as people, then it follows logically that those monuments to slaveholders must fall.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Fillet, for your time and for joining us on The Money Show. Thank you very much indeed.